Hello our viewers and welcome back to our channel. Now in this video we'll be talking about Thanksgiving. It being November, people are celebrating Thanksgiving and this has a different meaning to different people. Now for many it is a day of feasting, family and celebration, but for others it's a painful reminder of a twisted history, a history that has been sanitized, distorted and used to perpetuate a false narrative of harmony and friendship between European colonizers and Native Americans. But the truth is far more complex and far more painful. The arrival of European settlers marked the beginning of a long and brutal history of displacement, violence, and marginalization of Native American communities. Now, in this video, we'll explore the problematic history of Thanksgiving and why many people choose not to celebrate it. We'll hear from different people who are explaining why many people are not celebrating Thanksgiving now. So with that said, let's check out these videos. I will be right back.
I was talking with one of my relatives about why I don't celebrate Thanksgiving, and the first thing they said was that Thanksgiving suddenly became controversial. And I think there are a few folks who feel that way, so let's talk about it. It was really common to celebrate Thanksgiving, especially in elementary school. The adults would have half the students dress up as pilgrims and the other half dress up as Native Americans, which at the time we still called Indians. The kids dressing as pilgrims would make little hats out of construction paper with big old buckles on the front, and then the kids dressing up as Native Americans would make headdresses out of construction paper, and back then it was just innocent fun. So when did it all become political? Well, I hate to tell you, it's always been political, and it was always problematic and disrespectful. Imagine what it would be like for little children to grow up learning that it's okay to dress up as a characterized stereotype version of your community while reenacting a propagandized twisted narrative of your community's most deep historical trauma. A lot of peoples don't have to imagine that. That's actually still curriculum in a lot of places in the United States. And it's not like we've been celebrating Thanksgiving since the founding of this country. It's something that was invented by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. You know, the war over states' rights to continue doing slavery. In the middle of that, President Abraham Lincoln declared a national day of Thanksgiving to bring the country together over good food, great stories, lies, and propaganda. This created a twisted historical narrative of the original peoples of the United States, welcoming settlers and colonists with open arms while willingly giving up their land, their rights, and their personhood. And that's just not what happened. When Thanksgiving became a holiday, indigenous people did not have the right to citizenship, they did not have the right to vote. They were barely a generation removed from the forced displacement and relocation that historians now call the Trail of Tears. In other words, indigenous people did not have any say in their own lives or in the narratives about their people and their histories. Today, indigenous people continue to be under-resourced, face disproportionately high levels of violence, and land treaties continue to go disregarded in the United States. And today, due to the tireless, relentless, and dedicated advocacy of indigenous communities and organizations, there has been increased awareness and acknowledgement about indigenous people's history and humanity. And accordingly, this increased awareness has helped many people to understand that the history of Thanksgiving is problematic to say the least. Thanksgiving and the way that it's taught is not about celebrating anything real. It's about furthering historical propaganda and false narratives that portray indigenous people as being grateful for all of the violence and harm that they experienced, or worse, bringing it upon themselves, or worse, that they don't even exist anymore. And that's just not true either. And it overshadows the real, lasting, generational harm and violence that was done to indigenous people in the United States. The Wampanoag and Chappaquiddick nations in the northeast of the United States still exist today, despite all of the harm and violence that the Pilgrims perpetrated onto them. And for many of these communities, Thanksgiving isn't a celebration, it's a day of mourning. You can visit the Wampanoag and Chappaquiddick nations website to learn more about them, and by going to native-land.ca, you can learn whose land you're on, learn more about the people, and even consider providing reparations. Take an active interest in learning more, and if there are young people in your life, try to interrupt this cycle of propaganda and harm. Collective learning and healing is the way forward, and the only way that's going to happen is if we replace propaganda with the truth.
It must feel radical to break up with old patterns and traditions that you find out are truly horrible, such as Thanksgiving. Why should we celebrate what Europeans did to Native Americans, which is the bloody history of this country? Why can't we look back at that moment with compassion and shame and regret? And I don't speak for the First Nation, and from what I read, some of them have embraced this day as simply a day to be grateful for surviving. But we don't need to exaggerate Thanksgiving. And if we're going to celebrate it, we should at least acknowledge history. It's okay to acknowledge history. It's okay to regret and feel shame. That is the only way to move on to a positive direction without acknowledging the suffering that our European ancestors have caused to so many people. You shouldn't feel grateful for anything that is twisted. I'm sure on this day you will have a lot to be grateful for, but have compassion.
Family, it amazes me on how some people think that Thanksgiving was really a thing here in America, like it was all good. So let me tell you guys about one of the first American colonies that almost starved to death, and they got so desperate that they started consuming each other's flesh. That's right, cannibalism in America. And I'm not talking about the natives. The winters of 1609 and 1610, the Jamestown colony faced what you call starving times. Over 500 settlers were trapped inside their forts, and they all were surrounded by the natives who cut off their food supply. They couldn't hunt no more, and they couldn't farm. So guess what? They got desperate. First, they ate whatever they could: dogs, cats, mice, even leather shoes. But as that winter dragged on, things got much darker. So some of these settlers turned to cannibalism. In 2012, archaeologists found remains of a 14-year-old girl who had butcher marks on the remains. This was evidence that her body was consumed after she passed away. Hang on, it gets worse. A man unalived his own pregnant wife just to consume her, family. That's what happened. The leader of that colony, George Percy, wrote all about that shit. By the time the spring had arrived, 60 remained out of the original 500. This is one of the darkest chapters in American colonialism that they're never going to tell you about. So you're welcome.
Okay, so I got a lot of comments in my last video wanting an in-depth explanation about the history of Thanksgiving, so let's do it. So in public school and in Hollywood and the Western media, they portray this false narrative that Native Americans and Pilgrims, also known as colonizers, came together to celebrate coexistence with one another. The history of Thanksgiving dates back to 1621, and it included the colonizers and the Wampanoag people. This image here, it's like a false narrative that they're peaceful coexistence, when in reality the native people of this land were not only colonized but they were. It was President Abraham Lincoln who declared Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1863. This was happening during the Civil War. He set the Thanksgiving date to the final Thursday of every November. Reality is that Thanksgiving roots off celebrating the side of Native Americans in this country. It's really important to understand that settler colonialism uses erasure as a tool to write history in a wrong way in the white perspective. So it's important for us to take our control back, take control of the narrative. Thanksgiving is also known as the National Day of Mourning to a lot of Native American Indigenous people. Interested in learning more about the real history of the United States, I recommend you to start off with an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. I definitely have learned so much from this book. It's another book that I highly recommend is an Afro-Indigenous History of the United States by Kyle T. Mays. It's another book that is also really accessible in my opinion. I invite you and I challenge you, this Thanksgiving dinner, talk about what's happening in Gaza, talk about Palestine, and talk about how in the United States, the government has done this to people already. Let me remind you that Native Americans are alive. And not only are we alive, but we're thriving. And this is our land, and we stand in solidarity with all Indigenous people all across the world, from Palestine, from Mexico. My name is Shayla. I'm an Indigenous activist living in DC. I'm here to speak the truth. Make sure to like and follow for more content like this.
My dad is a Black Studies historian. If you need to know anything about history, he's the one to go to. And today he's going to break down the true history of Thanksgiving for you guys. Not only does he have his degree from Amherst College, he got his master's from Harvard, and he got his PhD from Boston College.
The Thanksgiving holiday started on October 2nd, 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln signed into law that the third Thursday in November would be set aside as a day of Thanksgiving. Now, if you know about that time period, this was happened less than 2 weeks after he signed the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was the time when the nation was still engaged in what's called the Civil War. And while the Thanksgiving was for reconciliation, for a way for the nation to come together. It was black people who gave it its real meaning. And over the next 2 years, when the war ended, it was black people who used that time to celebrate family. Because after the war, people were reconnecting families, building communities. And so the Thanksgiving holiday for black people became a way to celebrate that, to celebrate family and community and to come together. And that was the real meaning of the Thanksgiving for them. Mid-1870s, schools like Harvard University and others began playing their rivals in football on that holiday. And that's what connects football with Thanksgiving. Around the 1890s, during the time when immigration from Europe was at a peak in America, and you had the old guard, folks like the Mayflower folks, worried that America was losing its character. That's when they began to push the story of the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving with the indigenous population of Native Americans in Massachusetts. And they put that in there to try to create this idea of special America. But it was also a time when, in the 1890s, they were placing Indians on reservations and pretty much pushing them out of the society at the same time that they were trying to celebrate this idea of a holiday with Native Americans. But it was also the time when what's known as the Lost Cause had reached its peak. And that was the idea that the Civil War was a fight between soldiers from the North and South, and it was a noble cause, and so forth and so on. And they were pushing black people out of the history of that time period, and pushing them out of the history of having started Memorial Day, and of having, and the way that Thanksgiving was celebrated. So if you buy into complaining about Thanksgiving because it's, oh, Thanksgiving they stole from the Native Americans, and you're buying into a history that tries to erase black people, and it also tries to create the noble savage out of the Native American, and it's not the right image that we should be thinking of. And the one last thing is that in 1926, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, they decided to end it with a float of Santa Claus, which led into the shopping for the holiday season. And that's why you get shopping the day after Thanksgiving. All of this was created and took away from the original meaning of reconciliation, of families coming together, of celebrating one another.
Period. And that's why we need education reform, because they didn't teach us that.
It's never too late to stop celebrating Thanksgiving. It is a holiday that honestly celebrates God. With it currently happening in Palestine right now, it's just the perfect time to really think intentionally about what Thanksgiving actually is and means. I really understand, like, when we're younger, we have less of a sense of control over the holidays that we celebrate and uplift. But it's never too late to really start thinking critically about Thanksgiving and making the decision to discontinue observing and celebrating Thanksgiving.
Zion, New Israel, Spiritual Jerusalem. This is how the English Christian settlers who celebrated the first Thanksgiving in 1621 conceived of the land they were settling, America. Here's a quick history of the origins of Thanksgiving and its connections to Zionism. A group of Christians persecuted for some of their beliefs sought refuge in America and made their way here on a ship called the Mayflower in 1620. One of the leaders of the group was William Bradford, who conceived of the journey as an exodus to a promised land. As he was stepping off the ship in what is today's Plymouth, Massachusetts, he said, "Come, let us declare in Zion the word of God." After surviving their first year in America with the support of the Wampanoag indigenous people, at their first harvest, the Pilgrims, as they eventually called themselves, celebrated Thanksgiving. This was long before Zionism. Or was it? While there is a specific Zionist movement that emerged in Europe in the 19th century, Restorationism and Christian Zionism in America have for centuries made the conquest of Palestine from the Muslims their endgame. The extermination of the indigenous peoples of the Americas as the settlers gave thanks is directly connected to what we see in Palestine today.
Now, for many Americans, Thanksgiving is a special beloved holiday for eating turkey or a vegetarian main course option and spending time with friends and family. However, for others, the celebration is deeply controversial, as Thanksgiving has a contentious history that goes back to when the first feast was held. Now, in addition to a holiday steeped with cultural appropriation, the period of history in America is frequently palm color washed, which leads some Americans to ignore or condemn the holiday. Now, Thanksgiving is considered by some to be a national day of mourning. Like Columbus Day, the holiday is viewed by many to be a celebration of the conquest of Native Americans by colonists, or an embellished narrative of pilgrims and natives looking past their differences to break bread. Now, Professor Robert Jensen of the University of Texas at Austin previously suggested in an OPED that Americans replace the holiday with a national day of atonement, accompanied by a self-reflective collective fasting. One indication of moral progress in the United States would be the replacement of Thanksgiving Day and its self-endowment family feasting with a national day of atonement, accompanied by a self-reflective collective fasting. He wrote, "Now, one of the many issues with the holiday is its depiction in schools, with young children often taught about Thanksgiving through crafts and drawings. However, in addition to depictions of turkeys, the Mayflower, and the Pilgrims, many children decorate Native American headdresses, which frequently bear no resemblance to the headdresses, clothes, and feathers worn by the Wampanoag tribe, the tribe that encountered the Pilgrims. Now, these inaccurate historical references have been perpetuated year after year, making the battle for equality and accurate representation an ongoing one for Native Americans in America. Now, most Americans think the three-day celebration between the Pilgrims and Wampanoag tribe in 1621 in Massachusetts was the first Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims and their Native American neighbors had signed a mutual protection treaty the spring before, and the feast was in honor of a successful first harvest. But from the Pilgrims' point of view, the first Thanksgiving, meant to be a day set aside for prayer and worship, took place in July 1623. Now, Governor William Bradford declared a day of Thanksgiving to give thanks for the rain that had ended a drought and saved their harvest. Others insist the first Thanksgiving took place a few years before in 1619 in Virginia. In 1962, a Virginia state senator disputed President John F. Kennedy's assertion that Plymouth was the site of the first Thanksgiving. Now, America's first Thanksgiving was actually celebrated in Virginia in 1619, the senator told the president in a letter, referring to a religious ceremony that English settlers held when they arrived in Beckley Plantation near Richmond. "Please issue an appropriate correction." "You're quite right," came the reply from Mr. Kennedy's special assistant, the historian author. "I can only plead unconquerable New England bias on the part of the White House staff." Now, in 1789, President George Washington proclaimed a national day of Thanksgiving, asking Americans to gather on the last Thursday of November to give thanks for the establishment of a form of government for their safety and happiness. But some members of Congress objected, asserting that the authority to designate a day of thanks belonged to individual state governors, not the president. Now, others argued that Thanksgiving was a religious matter, therefore the government's establishment of a national Thanksgiving was forbidden by the First Amendment. Now, Washington proclaimed a second day of Thanksgiving in 1795, and Presidents John Adams, James Madison, and others did the same in subsequent years. But many presidents, particularly Thomas Jefferson, opposed this. It was not until 1863 that President Abraham Lincoln established the regular tradition of observing days of national Thanksgiving. Now, I just want to share something that Miss James, a member of the Wampanoag tribe who lives in Massachusetts, has to say about this holiday. Now, she says it's frustrating, it's saddening, and some years it's angering. We don't have any issues with people sitting down with their family and giving thanks. Miss James said, what we do object to is the Thanksgiving mythology. The origin of the Thanksgiving holiday dates back to a harvest feast held in 1621 between the Wampanoag, a native tribe who occupied the land long before, and the newly settled English colonists in America. Now, the gathering is widely seen as a celebration of the alliance between the two groups, but leaves out the ways in which those ties were broken. In the years after the Harvest Feast, foreign-born diseases arriving from Europe unalived many Native Americans. Others got unalived during conflict with English settlers seeking to gain control of their land. The U.S. government sought to forcibly assimilate children at over 400 government boarding schools operated between 1819 and 1969. Now, 1 in 3 Native Americans currently lives in poverty, according to Northwestern University's Institute for Policy Research, earning a median income of $23,000 a year. The myth, Ms. Jones said, ignores those realities. Instead of referring to the holiday as Thanksgiving, some like Ms. Smith recognize 24th November as National Day of Mourning. It has been celebrated in Plymouth, Massachusetts every year since 1970. Now, for those in attendance, the day begins with an opening prayer ceremony at a historic site named Coles Hill, a cemetery holding the graves of some of America's earliest settlers. Afterward, there are speeches and a march through the streets where they chant "Whose land, our land" can be heard. Across the country each November since 1975, others meet at Alcatraz Island in San Francisco. Now, they celebrate an event called Indigenous Peoples Thanksgiving Sunrise Gathering. Some refer to it as an Thanksgiving Day. Historians attribute the rise in activism for Native Americans in the 1970s to momentum driven by Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement the decade prior. Now, these events are meant to honor the Native Americans who occupied the land before the arrival of European settlers. They also draw awareness to what University of Arizona anthropology professor Edward Jolly calls historical traumas, like what was done to Native Americans in the wake of the Indian Removal Act, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson in 1830. Now, during the 1830s, roughly 100,000 Native Americans were forcibly moved from the southeast region of the U.S. to areas west of the Mississippi River. It estimated that around 15,000 got unalived on the journey, known today as the Trail of Tears. Now, Mr. Jolly's grandmother, born in 1912, received first-hand accounts from an elderly relative who survived the Trail of Tears. Those stories of unaliving and starvation were later passed down to Mr. Jolly, a descendant of the Oglala, Lakota, and Hodougli Muskogee tribes. That's something that I think a lot of people overlook or don't appreciate, just how raw and very real and ever-present these types of historical traumas are for a lot of Native peoples. He said, first-hand stories were told directly to Mr. Jolly too, from the same grandmother who later shared her experiences with him about her time as a student at an American Indian boarding school. Now, Mr. Jolly said her stories were filled with a lot of really unpleasant things. In May, the U.S. Department of the Interior released a report describing the former federal boarding schools as places rampant with physical and SA abuse, overcrowding, malnourishment, and disease, facts which the report said were well documented. Now, the unalivings of at least 500 Native children were also documented in the report, a number of expected to rise as the U.S. government continues to look into the troubled legacy of those institutions. Now, this fraught history, Mr. Jolly said, is why the Thanksgiving holiday for some, when only reflected upon as a happy gathering between pilgrims and Native Americans, is a painful reminder. Finally, come to the end of the video, but what do my viewers have to say about this holiday? What do you know? What controversy do you know surrounding this holiday? Share your thoughts and share everything you know in the comment section, and let's educate one another. Thank you for always watching, and see you in my next video as we bring you another interesting video.